Good Saturday morning, everyone, and welcome into today's daily Bible reading for November the 18th. Today we are reading together in Second Chronicles chapter 29, which is going to begin the first of four chapters focusing on King Hezekiah. To go ahead and give away a little bit of what we're going to see over the next four chapters, we're going to see a lot of focus on religious reform. There are a number of things that are focused on within the account of the writer of the Kings, First and Second Kings, that differs from what we see here in the writing of the chronicler. Here within this text, I think there is a tremendous focus primarily on the religious reforms and the spiritual restoration that Hezekiah brings to the people of Judah. And we're definitely going to see that today, here in chapter 29, which is going to focus on the restoration of temple worship. And then tomorrow, as we read through chapter 30, I believe it's tomorrow, chapter 30. I have to double check my calendar for this next week. But in chapter 30, we definitely are going to focus on this portion that talks about restoring the, restoring the chapter 30, chapter 30 tomorrow, which focus on restoring the observance of the Passover. This is something that seems to not have been done for quite some time. In fact, I'm not really sure if it was done with any sort of proper regularity during the time of the kings. But Hezekiah is definitely going to reintroduce that and set it up as a very important focus for the people of God. Chapter 31 is going to focus on removing idolatry. And then finally in chapter 32, we're going to get to what the kings seem to focus on more, which is kind of the military exploits of Hezekiah. Chapter 32 is the only chapter we're going to get that talks about the military thing, or the military accomplishments that Hezekiah was able to achieve, obviously with God's help. So definitely here in the chronicler, or with the chronicler's accounts, we're going to see main focus on the religious restoration for Hezekiah and the people at this time. So let me get that text up on the screen for us. We'll read along together here in Second Chronicles chapter 29. Second Chronicles chapter 29 and verse number 1 tells us that Hezekiah was 25 years old when he became king. Remember, his father was Ahaz, and he was terrible. But it tells us that the text does that he, Hezekiah, reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abijah, daughter of Zechariah. He did what was right in Yahweh's sight, just as his ancestor David had done. So this is obviously setting us up for good things from this king. In the first year of his reign, in the first month, he opened the doors of Yahweh's temple and repaired them. Then he brought in the priests and Levites and gathered them in the eastern public square. He said to them, "Hear me, Levites, consecrate yourselves now and consecrate the temple of Yahweh, the God of your ancestors. Remove everything impure from the holy place, for our ancestors were unfaithful and did what is evil in the sight of Yahweh our God. They abandoned him, turned their faces away from Yahweh's dwelling place, and turned their backs on him. They also closed the doors of the portico, extinguished the lamps, did not burn incense, and did not offer burnt offerings in the holy place of the God of Israel. Therefore, the wrath of Yahweh was on Judah and Jerusalem, and he made them an object of terror, horror, and mockery, as you see with your own eyes. Our fathers fell by the sword, and our sons, our daughters, and our wives are in captivity because of this. It is in my heart now to make a covenant with Yahweh, the God of Israel, so that his burning anger may turn away from us. My sons, don't be negligent now, for Yahweh has chosen you to stand in his presence, to serve him, and to be his ministers and burners of incense." Then the Levites stood up: Mahath, son of Amasai, and Joel, son of Azariah, from the Kohathites; Kish, son of Abdi, and Azariah, son of Jehalalel, from the Merarites; Joah, son of Zima, and Eden, son of Joah, from the Gershonites; Shimri and Juel, from the Elisaphanites; Zechariah and Mattaniah, from the Asaphites; Jehiel and Shimei, from the Hamanites; Shemaiah and Uzziel, from the Jeduthunites. They gathered their brothers together, consecrated themselves, and went according to the king's commands by the words of Yahweh to cleanse Yahweh's temple. The priest went to the entrance of Yahweh's temple to cleanse it. They took all the unclean things they had found in Yahweh's sanctuary to the courtyard of Yahweh's temple. Then the Levites received them and took them outside to the Kidron Valley. They began the consecration on the first day of the first month, and on the 8th day of the month they came to the portico of Yahweh's temple. They consecrated Yahweh's temple for 8 days, and on the 16th day of the first month they finished. Then they went inside to King Hezekiah and said, "We have cleansed the whole temple of Yahweh, the altar of burnt offering and all its utensils, and the table for the rows of the bread of the presence and all its utensils. We have set up and consecrated all the utensils that King Ahaz rejected during his reign when he became unfaithful. They are in front of the altar of Yahweh." King Hezekiah got up early, gathered the city officials, and went to Yahweh's temple. They brought 7 bulls, 7 rams, 7 lambs, and 7 male goats as a sin offering for the kingdom, for the sanctuary, and for Judah. Then he told the descendants of Aaron, the priest, to offer them on the altar of Yahweh. So they slaughtered the bulls, and the priest received the blood and splattered it on the altar. They slaughtered the rams and splattered the blood on the altar. They slaughtered the lambs and splattered the blood on the altar. Then they brought the goats for the sin offering right into the presence of the king and the congregation, who laid their hands on them. The priests slaughtered the goats and put their blood on the altar as a sin offering to make atonement for all Israel. For the king said that the burnt offering and the sin offering were for all Israel. Hezekiah stationed the Levites in Yahweh's temple with cymbals, harps, lyres, according to the command of David, Gad, the king's seer, and the prophet Nathan. For the command was from Yahweh through his prophets. The Levites stood with the instruments of David, and the priests with the trumpets. Then Hezekiah ordered that the burnt offering be offered on the altar. When the burnt offerings began, the song of Yahweh and the trumpets began, accompanied by the instruments of King David of Israel. The whole assembly was worshiping, singing the song and blowing the trumpets. All of this continued until the burnt offering was completed. When the burnt offerings were completed, the king and all those present with him bowed down and worshipped. Then King Hezekiah and the officials told the Levites to sing praise to Yahweh in the words of David and of the seer Asaph. So they sang praises with rejoicing and knelt low and worshipped. Hezekiah concluded, "Now you are consecrated to Yahweh. Come near and bring sacrifices and thanksgiving offerings to Yahweh's temple." So the congregation brought sacrifices and thanksgiving offerings, and all those with willing hearts brought burnt offerings. The number of burnt offerings the congregation brought was 70 bulls, 100 rams, and 200 lambs. All these were for a burnt offering to Yahweh. 600 bulls and 3,000 sheep and goats were consecrated. However, since there were not enough priests, they weren't able to skin all the burnt offerings. So their Levi brothers helped them until the work was finished and until the priests consecrated themselves. For the Levites were more conscientious to consecrate themselves than the priests were. Furthermore, the burnt offerings were abundant, along with the fat of the fellowship offerings and with the drink offerings for the burnt offering. So the service of Yahweh's temple was established. Then Hezekiah and all the people rejoiced over how God had prepared the people, for it had come about suddenly. And that is 2 Chronicles chapter 29. 2 Chronicles chapter 29. Man, I mean, just again, we're thinking about the progression of the throne of Judah, just going from king to king to king, and think about it from the perspective of Judah as a difference from Israel. In Israel, there was a changing of dynasty. So every so often, a new dynasty would take over the throne, and they would have really nothing to do with the previous dynasty. But as far as Judah goes, it is just going from father to son. So it's continuing on in the lineage of David. So you might have a father who is terrible, and then a son who comes after him who is actually pretty good, and vice versa. You might have a son or a father who is pretty good, and then a son who comes along who's pretty wicked. Well, here we have the former. We have an evil father in Ahaz, who I want to note specifically what we see in chapter 28, verse number 24. Then Ahaz gathered up the utensils of God's temple, cut them into pieces, and notice this, shut the doors of Yahweh's temple. So basically, Ahaz put a halt to all of the worship of Yahweh whenever it came to what took place in his temple. So he just put a stop to it. Well, what do we see with Hezekiah? Well, we'll see with Hezekiah that he does the opposite. That if you're, drawing, coloring, making notes, anything like that, luckily for me, the way my Bible's laid out, verse 24 of chapter 28 is right across the page from chapter 29 and verses 3 and 4, which talk about how on the left side of the page, talks about how Ahaz closed the doors. Right across from that, we read how Hezekiah opened the doors and repaired them, and not just them, but so much more. What he recognizes is his father had made all these grievous errors in cutting off worship of Yahweh through his temple. He basically cut off the relationship between Yahweh and his people, because the temple was that connection point. It was a place where God's spirit resided and lived among the people. And then the priests were the conduits between the people and God because of their holy and purified and consecrated nature. So with all that not working, there really is a big disconnect between Yahweh and his people. So Hezekiah sees this issue. He not only opens the doors, but he also gathers the priests and Levites and says, hey, you all need to consecrate yourselves. Actually, he's in Judah. He's in the southern portions. So he probably said, y'all need to gather yourselves and purify yourselves. That's what consecrate means. You need to consecrate yourself, and then you need to go and you need to consecrate the temple. Because remember, we noticed with a few of these wicked kings that they allowed for impurities to be brought into the temple and for the temple itself to be defiled. So this very sacred space, at least should have been sacred space of the temple, had been violated in many ways. So Hezekiah sees that it's time for that to be restored. That purified state, that consecrated and sacred state needed to be restored to the temple. So it was up to the priests and the Levites to do that. So you need to consecrate yourselves, and then you need to go in and need to remove anything that is impure from the holy place. For our fathers, what they did was evil. They turned their faces from Yahweh. They turned their backs on him. They closed the doors. They extinguished the lamps. They did not burn incense. They did not offer burnt offerings in the holy place of the God of Israel. So because they made these mistakes, we need to go in and we need to fix that. We have got some work to do, brothers. We've got much work to do. And you are going to be the ones who are going to spearhead that, because again, they were the priests and Levites. They were the spiritual leaders of Israel at this time. So because Hezekiah sees the need, because he understands there's wrath against the people because of the failures of the fathers, because we saw their failures, and we see the consequences of that. The fact that they had been taken into captivity. Remember, chapter 28 tells us about the people being taken into captivity by the pagan kings, and even some of the Israelites were going to take them into captivity until God sent his prophet to address that issue. But Hezekiah is saying, we see all this. We see the negligence on the part of our fathers. We cannot continue in that. Just because they started it does not mean we have to continue it. We are going to bring some necessary reforms. So all these Levites stand up. They gathered all the brothers together, the Levites and the priests. Again, they consecrate themselves, and then they went about doing the king's command. They go into the entrance. They took out all the unclean things, and they took them to the Kidron Valley, the garbage dump, basically, and they trashed them and they burned them. And then they began with the portico of the temple. They end up consecrating the temple. It tells us how long it took them to do that. And then they go to Hezekiah and they say, hey, what you've asked us to do, we have done. We have cleansed the whole temple, the altar of burnt offerings, the utensils, the tables, of the rows of showbread. We've set all this up. We've consecrated everything. Everything that Ahaz did that was wrong, we have rectified. We have fixed it. Everything is how it ought to be. So because the sacred space has now been restored, because now that sacred space has been made sacred again, then Hezekiah says, all right, well, we're going to use the temple, what it's supposed to be used for, which is a place of worship. So they gather all these sacrifices, and the first thing they do is they offer sin sacrifices. They restore the relationship between themselves and God. They make atonement for the sins, not only of the people, but again, just fixing everything that has been undone by the previous administration of King Ahaz. And at this point, they are able to enter into worship, and then they start offering sacrifices on behalf of everyone. There's worship that takes place with the cymbals and the trumpets and the lyres. They're singing. There are offerings, burnt offerings. There is, let's see here, verse number 31. The congregation brought sacrifices and thank offerings, and all those with a willing heart brought burnt offerings. So this was not something that was done purely out of a command for or by the king, but people had a willing heart to do this. They brought these fellowship offerings to come and to participate and to recognize the fellowship that they have between them and God. And so many animals were offered here, so much so that there weren't actually enough Levites, or there were not enough priests to be able to do all the work on their own. So the Levites, those who had consecrated themselves, because the text tells us, which is kind of a strange thing, that the Levites were more conscientious to consecrate themselves in the priest work. So it seems that not enough priests had gone about this work. Remember, back in the beginning, Hezekiah talks about that you Levites need to hear me, and all the priests need to hear me. You need to see the necessity to consecrate yourself so you could do this work. So maybe not enough of them had thought it necessary for them to consecrate themselves, the priests, but then the Levites thought, well, we need to do that too. So they end up doing it. And because they're consecrated, they can't actually offer, they don't actually make the offerings, but they help with the skinning and stuff. Because again, just because you were a Levite doesn't mean you were a priest. But if you were a priest, that means you are a Levite. So Levites are not going to actually offer the sacrifices, but they're going to help in the process of doing all that, because again, they see this as a strong need, and because they are consecrated, they are able to do such a thing. So while they're waiting for the priests to consecrate themselves, the Levites are helping, and then all these burnt offerings and the fat of the fellowship offerings and the drink offerings are being done, and all of this is described as the service of Yahweh's temple. It was established. So that which had been neglected, verse number 11, my sons, don't be negligent now, for Yahweh has chosen you to stand in his presence, to serve him, and to be his ministers and burners of incense. Don't be negligent now. Excuse me there. Don't be negligent now like our fathers have been before. Don't be negligent in that way. See the importance of worship and the importance of being prepared to worship. And let's get down to business. Let's do what we need to do. And in doing that, again, a beautiful sentence, that the service of Yahweh's temple was established. It would be better if there was not a need for restoration and for these reforms to be brought in by Hezekiah. But we don't do that. That just wasn't the case with the reign of Ahaz and some other kings before him. But Hezekiah, again, sees the need. He understands the need, and he's going to get to work. And that's what he does. He prepares the people to be able to do this work for Yahweh. And again, that's such an important concept, to be prepared to do this work. We can't just, even though this came about suddenly, that's what the text says at the end of chapter 29, that this had all come out suddenly, but they recognized that Yahweh was the one who had helped prepare the people. Even though this was recognized as a sudden need out of nowhere, oh, we need to be doing these things, Yahweh had helped them and blessed them to be able to prepare themselves to do this work. So we need to recognize that ourselves, the necessity to prepare ourselves to do work for Yahweh. It's very hard for us to live a certain way, to live like the world, to think like the world, to ingest everything that the world throws at us, and then just wake up one day and say, oh, I need to do this, and that for God. Sure, you might be able to work your way to doing that. Yes, you can turn your affections away from the world and to God, but we are not going to be able to, allow me to use this accommodative language, we're not going to be able to perform at our best for God if we have not prepared our hearts to do so. Again, if everything that we are about is worldly and fleshly, then how can we just suddenly one day do a complete 180 and think that we're going to perform really excellently in a spiritual way? That's just not going to happen. We need to prepare ourselves. That's what they did. They prepared themselves to be able to do this work for Yahweh, and friends when you do the exact same thing. So let's think about that today. Let's think about preparing our hearts to serve Yahweh and to live lives that bring glory and honor to him. If you have any questions about this text here in Second Chronicles chapter 29, please feel free to leave that in the comment section below. And I appreciate you taking some time to read along with me on this Saturday. Hope that you'll join me tomorrow as we read together from Second Chronicles chapter 30. Take care and God bless.